We are live at Immunology 2025 with a live episode of the Immunology Podcast. I'm Jason Goldsmith, and this is Brenda Roud, and we are the hosts of the Immunology Podcast, where we have conversations with immunologists. So as I said, this is a special episode. We get to do these when we come to immunology conferences. So that's Immunology 2025. We're live in Honolulu, Hawaii, here at the Hawaii Convention Center. And we're going to have a bit of fun today. We're mixing it up a little bit. Instead of us interviewing someone, Brenda and I are going to be in the hot seat and kind of look back at the past 100 plus episodes we've had here. So, Brenda.
Indeed. So before we get started, I want to introduce Dr. Nicole Quinn. She is the Director of Brand and Scientific Communications at STEMCELL, our sponsor company. And she is a very important member of the team for the Immunology Podcast and the producing team. And she is also a podcaster herself. And you can hear more about her work at Scientific Communications in a special episode of the podcast, episode 96, Scientific Mentoring. And we are so happy and so lucky to have her on the team. Nothing of this would happen without Nicole.
Wow, that was a lot. Thanks, Brenda. And thank you all again for coming. So as Brenda noted, or Jason noted, this is a different episode. We are putting Jason and Brenda in the interview chair instead of the interviewer seat. But before we get into asking them questions, I wanted to give a little bit of background on the Immunology Podcast and how we got here, ultimately to the AAI, but also to 100 plus episodes of the podcast. So I want you to all remember back to a very special time in our lives, March 2020. So we all know what was happening at that time. So what the situation we were in, we already had at STEMCELL, the STEMCELL Podcast. We've been running it for many years, and we knew that we ultimately wanted to produce something very similar for the immunology world. And, we were busy. We just kind of hadn't got to it yet. And then COVID hit, and we realized this is the time. We have to do it now. Not only because scientists were suddenly at home, they weren't in their labs, they weren't going to conferences. We all know we were supposed to all be here in May of 2020, and of course now it's 5 years later and we finally are. So we wanted to provide a way for scientists to connect with each other, but also because we had this massive scientific crisis on our hands that specifically related to immunology. So we decided to launch the Immunology Podcast at that time, got to work, put out some ads for hosts. Thankfully, Jason and Brenda both saw those ads and applied. And so we met your wonderful hosts here and kicked off the podcast about a year after that in March 2021. And that's sort of the story. We've built up relationships with the AAI and other societies along the way, and spoken to people from all over the world, right from this sort of junior trainee right through Nobel laureates, and had a really awesome time doing it. So we've had over 500,000 downloads for the podcast, and our episodes have reached 182 countries around the world. So that's pretty cool for just an idea we had, and now we're here. So looking back, let's start with a big picture question. So you've had conversations with researchers across the scientific spectrum, from early PI, early or junior researcher, all the way through Nobel laureate. So what has that been like? Do you have any insights that you can offer overall?
Well, of course, it was such an amazing opportunity to get the chance to speak to so many very accomplished scientists across immunology fields, which you don't always get. I'm a postdoc, I work hard, but having access to everyone around the world, it's quite a privilege. And I like to say that for me, like the nicest part of it, or a very nice part of it, was to have access to, the OG immunologist, which I recently learned it doesn't stand for old guy, it stands for original gangster. So really people that have been instrumental in like very fundamental parts of our understanding of immunology, things like, what does CD28 do? And we had Mark Jenkins from University of Minnesota telling us about his experience. This is like the 80s, the 90s, really early baby steps in immunology. And we had Carl June, who besides, being the father of CAR T-cell therapy, he also was instrumental in understanding the TCR complex. We had James Allison, also not only checkpoint inhibition, but also very early TCR structural work. We had Jeff Bluestone, similar. The first anti-CD3 antibody came from his lab in the 80s. And it's just such an amazing opportunity to interact with the people that, put all those things that you now read in your Genoway, textbooks. They didn't know that. Those things were not known before these people discovered them. And as a more recent trainee of immunology, that kind of, in a very naive way, blows my mind. And that's probably one of the biggest kind of takeaway experiences for me, is being there and experiencing this basic fundamental immunology from the horse's mouth, so to say.
Jason, anything to add?
I think for me, it's appreciating the humanity of everyone on the podcast. When you read that textbook and you read that paper with the name behind it, it's one thing, but getting to both appreciate the way different scientists think and how they were able to solve their problems or recognize things, but also the fact that pretty much everyone on the podcast has a very, very specific superpower they want, or had a plan to open a coffee shop, or has some artistic angle that they wish they had more time for. There's a lot of musicians, interestingly,
indeed,
in the faculty world and even the postdoc world. And so realizing the journey that the scientists all take, we're kind of on a shared voyage, and there's a lot more overlap than I think maybe earlier trainees appreciate, when that PI is that person in the office that you got to book a meeting out with in a week from then, and kind of scares you a little bit.
Yeah, scientists are just people is an early lesson I learned as a very intimidated master's student, where you don't understand anything, and you're in sessions and lectures, and you're like, how do all these people get it? And then realizing you just have to remember they're humans, and they all have lives and have made mistakes. And I think a podcast like this, it exposes that a little bit more and can lower that intimidation barrier a bit. Another big picture question, shifting more to the sort of immunology, what insights or overall impressions on the field of immunology, having had this vantage point of 100 plus conversations, and not only that, covering, each of you cover a couple papers in every episode. So you've also sort of been forced to read all of these papers and really think about them in depth. Like, what can you glean as sort of the big picture about immunology from that?
For me, of course, having the opportunity to have a very broad overview of immunology. So I'm a T-cell immunologist in my day job. So it's very easy to just be very focused on your small thing. But because of this, I have a very good excuse to read about B cells, macrophages, gamma delta T cells. And I think that the realization that really kind of struck me, and that it's just been growing in me for years now, also as part of my training, is that immunology is everything. Immunology is everywhere. Everything in the body seems to be immunology at some point. Aging, it's an immunological, effect. If you have a stroke and you need to repair that muscle, that's going to be immune cells are going to be mediating that recovery. Cardiovascular disease is mostly an inflammation that's caused by immune cell signaling, things like that. It's just every paper that we discuss, sometimes is unexpected things that immune cells do, and I think that's probably the thing that excites me the most. We have an understanding of immune system as curing disease, preventing preventing growth of cancer, things like that. But then there is this other kind of, I want to say moonlighting, but it's like, I think it's more than that, function of these immune cells, that because they're so good at transmitting information and at kind of picking up their environment and then sending some kind of signal, and based on what they are seeing, that they make great messengers for other things as well. And that's just... we have now some papers that we've discussed about, being involved in like insulin production and things like that. And you're like, why are they doing these things? And when you think about it, it makes sense, because they can. Why? It's just because the task needs to be done, and this is the very malleable system that can basically do it all.
Very cool insights. Jason?
So I'm going to go to one of my running statements on the podcast, which is everything seems to be a skid mark. So it used to be you have a TH1 and a TH2, and then now there's TH17s, and now there's ILCs, and I've never met an immunologist that doesn't love a cell surface marker and flow, but I think we're realizing that while there's these flag post states, there's a lot of transition between them, and it's really a lot more flux than we appreciate. And when you look at the clustering, even on something like a single cell RNA-seq, TISNI or UMAP, it's not like it's like 3 dots for the 3 different states. That you can draw them, but they're all somewhat superimposed, and there's a Venn diagram going on. And so I think that's one of the big things. I think the other thing is that we're probably in a golden age of immunology right now. We had kind of a first age where you're like, oh, here's a T cell receptor, and we know what an antibody is more than it's a protein, and now we know how it works. And I think that was the first era, but we've now gained the technology, and we've also gained the ability to alter human health through immunology, and that is something that I think is relatively new and still on an exponential growth curve. And that's something that I think is very precious for the field right now.
Mm-hmm. On that topic of human health and moving things into the clinic, you've talked to a lot of academic researchers who are also board members or have started up, sort of spin-off companies or are trying to move something through clinical trials. And my impression as a having come through the academic system is that's pretty new. It used to be very much you're an academic, or you choose the biotech path, or you choose the pharmaceutical path or pharma path, or you move into government, and it's sort of these distinct things with pretty big walls between them. And now it seems to be, you speak of, I don't know if I like the word skid mark, but maybe like smear or spectrum is a little bit better. Can you speak to that? Is it a new trend, and what, any insights from speaking to people who are kind of transitioning through that?
Yeah, I think the silos used to exist because the number of steps that you had to take to go from a project in a lab to a drug were much bigger. And so someone would read a paper in a pharma company and go run with it. And now the pharma companies or the biotechs work hand in hand, right? And a small startup biotech is just that spin off of an idea, and that can get acquired or what have you. But I think, we had a guest on, Rahul Roy Chowdhury, who had said that in academics, you're taught how to ask a question, and in biotech, you're taught how to solve a problem. And I think you're seeing that now have to hand in hand. You ask an interesting question, and now the answer to that question can solve a problem, but how can it solve a problem? And so you're seeing a transformation in the marketplace, again, in immunology because of the success of it. Mm-hmm. I think that it's proven that you can do this, and it's not true in every other field.
I think that maybe I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but kind of following that idea of moving into outside of academia, into industry, into the clinic. I think it's very important, and more and more we see it. And I think in part because we see that so many of the kind of recent breakthroughs in therapy have been kind of immunological approaches to diseases that originally were not thought of as an immunological disease. So I mentioned, of course, James Allison. I mentioned Carl June, and I would say like they became kind of the inflection point. Of course, they're not the only persons that were involved in this area, but their research and their push into the clinic and their contribution and their kind of commitment to get their research into the clinic with the help of stakeholders really initiated massive therapeutic avenues that were closed before them, right? So checkpoint inhibition, there's I would say for many cancers, there's an before and an after checkpoint inhibition treatment, cell therapy, and of course CAR T cell therapy is probably the first one that really got successfully translated into patients, but that has opened the floodgates to so many other approaches to cell therapy. And I would say cancer, before that, cancer, nobody really thought of cancer as an immunological disease. And I think there's other examples of, neurological diseases that have a strong immunological component. You can treat some kinds of schizophrenia with prednisone. That's not, that's kind of strange. Now we know it, but I'm pretty sure people had a lot of pushback when they're trying to, to bring this to the medical discourse. And I think that's very important to have that connection, especially in today's how the system works today. You need all of these stakeholders together, and I think you need academics to push for the things that they believe in, and interact, either cross a bit, I put a foot or both feet on the other side, or really become a bridge to where the money comes from, where the patients are, and also where the society is that it needs to accept these new therapies as valid options for treatment.
I think it goes back even further than that. I'll do a quick just raise the hand audience poll here. How many people in the audience have ever used a monoclonal antibody in a flow or a Western blot?
Yeah,
right. Everyone, right? Pretty much.
Lots of people for our listeners.
Yeah, pretty much everyone. Those are drugs, right? Like, we didn't used to have monoclonal antibodies, and the very first thing that happened was they started making monoclonal antibodies, and then they're like, oh, I can have a drug that's a monoclonal antibody against a cytokine. And one of the very first of those was Remicade, which is an anti-TNF, and that revolutionized the treatment of psoriasis and inflammatory bowel disease, and took something that was lethal in many cases or life-crippling and made it a chronic condition. And that was the first of this, right? And then after that, you had more advanced monoclonal antibodies and this checkpoint inhibitors, and then you have cell therapy. And it is very uncommon to have what I call this hat trick, or multiple things, success after success in one field, driving not just a new drug, but an entire new therapy. There's an entire division of the FDA now devoted to biologics that wasn't here when we were figuring out what the T-cell receptor was, right? And to have that happen and it keep working is really the groundbreaking effect. Now you're looking at bispecific antibodies and antibodies that add, cytotoxic agents on, and next generation. Can I do, gene therapy? Can I use gene therapy approaches to induce CAR T cells in vivo versus ex vivo? So it just keeps coming, and that's what I mean by that renaissance. It's remarkable to see, and something that I have not seen in any other, therapeutic area ever. It's astonishing.
Immunology, the gift that keeps on giving.
Okay, so my next question, it's a similar theme, but you're both scientists. You both, Jason now works in industry, but you're both researchers by training. And so your minds are probably always, and we're trained as scientists to always connect dots and think big and ask questions and build hypotheses. And so in your unique vantage point of having spoken to over 100 researchers, have you had any like aha moments or anything that have like connecting the dots or light bulbs that have gone off? Any themes that have emerged that have sort of benefited you as an individual researcher?
Well, I have to say there's two fields of immunology that I became very acutely aware of, or really made me think, how was I not aware of this before? And I would say these two areas are neuroimmunology. I think I already kind of touched upon it, and reproductive immunity. And those are I think those are two fields that are in great growth right now. We had, for example, we have a few guests in the podcast. We had, so I think our first guest talking about reproductive immunity, I think, was Francesco Colucci from University of Cambridge. We had other also American researchers. We had Adrian Ehrenbacher and from UCSD, I think. And this idea of so important understanding the relationship between the mother and the fetus. And I think we just take it for granted that, women carry children and somehow they don't die, even though they are, have all these antigens that come from the father. And I think we have been blinded to how complex and what a tug of war that relationship actually is. And it has been very interesting to see all the research also, because we have very difficult to have good animal models to study. The interface between the placenta and the mother, because every different mammals have different, and it turns out that mice are quite different from humans, so they're not good models. So people have, been trying to going through the animal kingdom, trying to find better models to study this very intimate relationship, and trying to understand what are those cells that are keeping this fetus protected. But on the other hand, the fetus, and the placenta they are ravenous. They are like, I don't want to say parasitical because that sounds kind of
Parasitic.
bad.
As a mother, I can say parasitic. Yeah.
But there you go. But it's just an amazing when you start looking into it and you start listening to the research. It's just this weird, mind blowing relationship, and I think we need to understand so much more about that. So that was really a revelation. And on the other hand, of course, neuroimmunology. We had, I think, the first guest that we had very early on was Isaac Chiu from from Harvard University, and it was fun because the topic was the immune system and and in the perception of itch and, like, scratch, and how you have all these relationships with the neurons or specific neurons that will detect itch and give this signal to your brain that we interpret as itch. And they're different from pain, and they're different from pressure. There's like different things, and how this people that have this kind of idiopathic itch, they just feel itchy for no identifiable reason. And sometimes some of these patients is because you have this immune activation that is wrong, and it's just getting in the way of their body, interpreting the signals in the right way, that it's not itch, it's just a normal existence. And that really got me thinking. And then from that, we had so many. We had other Jonathan Kipnis from the University of Washington in St. Louis talking about the importance of those immune cells that are resident in the brain. We have bone marrow in our skull that actually produces immune cells that are specifically affecting our brain. The whole blood-brain barrier situation is not as tight as we think. There is movement of T cells, of immune cells under certain circumstances. So it's not immune. What's the word? Immune privileged in the way we thought, and it's so important to keep. These cells are so important to keep inflammation down. Inflammation in the brain is horrible, it's terrible. It will, the interferon gamma in the brain is extremely dangerous, and there's many cells devoted to keeping that in check. And so those kind of things, and we had so many papers that we've covered, especially I would say the last year. At least from my side, I think like a third of the papers have been neuroimmunology, because it's just Tregs are there, of course, all the resident immune cells we already knew about, but you have, T cells, you have macrophages, some of them are, resident, some of them can come in, and they all do things that will eventually, I think this is kind of the scary part, they can affect our cognition, our behavior, our interpretation of the world. And I think that's just also like literally mind-blowing, if you ask me.
Nice pun. Awesome.
I appreciate the pun as the one who usually victimizes
I
you
know.
with those.
I'm here for you, Jason.
Thank you. So, I mean, I'll add in the microbiome because I think I'm contractually obligated to
Yes,
do
you
so.
That's your thing.
But I think actually the microbiome teaches us a larger lesson. So Arthur Mortha's work, right, recently, of how certain organisms in the gut will then, through the immune system, convey signals to the pancreas and lungs and brain for things. And to your point of neuroimmunology, I think my biggest theme that I've really appreciated is we're really big multicellular organisms, right? We don't just have multiple cells, we've got multiple organs. You have a entire secondary circulatory system, the lymph system, in addition to blood, and coordinating everything across all of that. Kind of like, oh yeah, of course we coordinate it. We got nerves that tell us things, and obviously our body all works together. But I've really come to appreciate in the last year that coordination probably is largely, the runners of it are the immune system. in ways that aren't just like, hey, you're infected, go kill that, right? That makes sense, right? Because that's the organ's job, is to protect the body. But I think another role of the immune system is very much like a nervous system. But whereas the nerves are, very specifically conducting from the brain and through those loops, there's other signals that our body never evolved nerves to do.
Right.
But we had immune cells, and those immune cells could migrate. And so I've been even talks here where immune cells migrate from one organ to another and convey with that a signal that alters that other organ. And that can be from the microbiome, or it can be from just the other tissues activity. And so while the microbiome is a constant reminder that your immune system is coordinating all of this external environment sensing, it's actually a larger theme. And I think our immune systems have an entire function around organ-to-organ coordination that is much more like the nervous system than we think, but works very differently, and is something that we're just now starting to appreciate. And we have some canonical examples, but it's probably much, much broader than that.
Yeah. I mean, they're real hustlers, the immune cells. They're just, they're not, one job is not enough. They just need to have, several side projects to be entertained.
I loved how passionate both of you got in that answer, and you just started going, and then like kept thinking of more and more things that you thought were cool. So it's really sort of special vantage point to have, to be able to speak to so many people from across the field and connect these dots. My next question is, have you had any unexpected moments on the podcast, things you didn't expect to be talking about, or guests you didn't expect to have?
Sharks.
It's the sharks.
The Hanover Mott's and the sharks. I will never forget that. I think I really credit my postdoc mentor for Yohai Chen for making me think about everything from an evolutionary lens, at least for a moment. But the whole shark story and how we have this ancient organism here that's already highly evolved, and his work looking at B cells and how they have, somatic hypermutation, but don't have canonical germinal centers, but they've had something that at least does the job well enough. But what we're learning about evolution and biology from that, I didn't expect. It kind of makes sense. Okay, go look at, an old organism and C. elegans and stuff. But the fact that we're looking at sharks and that we have shark labs now, and how much that's teaching us, I think is just fascinating. We've also had talked a little bit about plant immunology, but I think that's like a Wild West to most of us here. I don't see a plant symposium, and I know this exists in the agricultural community, but there's probably a lot of really interesting crosstalk that we could have with plant immunologists if we went there. And for me, it's just those lessons like, oh, this is actually conserved. What the heck does that mean?
Yeah, I think we should do more plant immunology. My first paper was actually when I collaborated in a project about plant immunity.
Plants. I'll tell the story of how the sharks. So it was Immunology 2025 that we went to, and Christina, who's sitting over there, went to Hanover Mott's talk on sharks and was like, "You need to come on our podcast," and that's how that happened. So very cool. Thanks to the AAI. Okay, so my next question. So we as I spoke to at the beginning here, we launched in March 2021. So a few months into the COVID, or a year into the COVID pandemic, but a few months into vaccines. Vaccines were being distributed at that time, and research was happening fast, and things were changing fast. And I know that a lot of what you were covering at that time was COVID. So can you reflect back on what it was like launching an immunology podcast at that time, and sort of how that journey has gone, what it was like in such an unprecedented time to be speaking to the immunology world?
I have to admit, I have a bit of retrograde amnesia because of that time. It was hard. It was a blur. It's like three. No, it's just kidding.
It was a skid mark. Is that what you
it was a skid mark in my brain? Yeah, for sure. No, it was very remarkable, and I remember being so kind of aware of everything that was going on. I was kind of stuck in my home most of the time. I only got to go to the lab for very specific things. And, a bit scared, following. By the time we were we were interviewing for the podcast, and I was just following the vaccine race and looking at all the preclinical trial, there's this fast track clinical trials, and just looking at AstraZeneca, is a Pfizer, is a Moderna, and I remember it was a blur. So when the time came to actually start seriously debating this, because we did that a lot with Jason, we were following the latest. We even, I think, covered a few preprints, because the information was out immediately, and it was published so fast, and it was such a whirlwind. It's just all the time new things, and also the scares around the thrombosis that came out with AstraZeneca vaccines and things like that, and just trying to provide a sensible overview of what's going on, trying to find, not, you cannot talk about everything, but trying to really select the most important pieces of information that were coming out, following the right stakeholders to understand, and kind of from our very humble position, give an educated commentary on what was going on. And I kind of felt it was important. It felt meaningful to try your best to be updated and to understand the research for real, and being confident on what we were covering, and because it felt very important. The kind of research that could be done in human populations, that experiments that came out that would have only been able in mice, basically. That was also fascinating to have that access to that very unique study system, and people run with it. So that's also really cool to see. At least the scientific community made a lot of novel research about vaccinology, about infectious disease, that could have never been possible without this, tragic event. But at least we learn from it. We take the situation and we trying to make the lemonade from the lemons to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
I think we saw that with the HIV epidemic earlier, but we had way more tools. In fact, a lot of the HIV tools from the HIV epidemic
absolutely
let us do what we did with COVID. But, imagine if we started like sequencing every rhinovirus like we did for COVID.
Right.
There's probably long rhinovirus and long influenza syndromes and stuff, but that COVID, that natural just jump of a virus really start letting us appreciate things about infectious disease that are probably more uniform and universal, but it's going to take us time to appreciate that.
Yep.
You guys provided me the perfect segue into this next question, which is about the toolbox. So you spoke about how COVID and the HIV and pandemic, or epidemic, I guess, gave you new tools. What other new methodologies, technologies, what have you learned about from your conversations on the Immunology podcast about the tools we have as immunologists now that are emerging or in use?
I think the big theme is, when I started, you couldn't get published without a single-cell RNA-seq in your paper, and now you can't get published without a single-cell transcriptomic, or a single-cell, visual transcriptomics on your tissue. I remember as a postdoc thinking about doing that, and then just the lasers and setup for it were nearly impossible, or prohibitively expensive. And now, in the last probably 3 or 4 years, being able to do tissue transcriptomics is the big change. So for me, that's the big thing, is we finally have compute, and you can sequence everything, or you can use all these different technologies to tag things. And now we're finally applying it to tissue sections and localized effects, whereas before we were able to suck up individual cells and count, but now we're getting spatial information. So if I had to guess, if first we were able to get read depth and then we're able to get spatial depth, the next trick we're going to be able to do is time courses on spatial transcriptomics. And that'll probably start somehow in, with dead things that you correlate over time, but ideally in the end, you'll have live in vivo spatial readouts of signals over time. But that's probably another 5 or 10 years away because of the problem of doing it in living things.
Yeah, I guess I agree with that. Spatial transcriptomics, spatial analyses. There were some talks also today at this conference yesterday. I think basically the being able to measure meaningful things on very small samples, on very small amounts of cells, and the increase in sensitivity of so many assays that allows us to really pick really small amounts of study like individual neurons, for neuroimmunology, study individual neurons and which are the cells that are interacting. I, I'm still a bit waiting for example, AI. So we discussed that in our lab show last year in Chicago. The importance, like using AI, for example, for predicting protein structures. I think that's getting more and more established. I'm just waiting to see what more AI will do for us. I think that we are only like we're not even in the reaching the kind of the top of the wave just now. So I think that's probably going to be very transformational. Analyzing data with the help of artificial intelligence, and yeah, and I guess also using having such a big breadth of data and being able to analyze that. It's also scary because then you need a bioinformatician for every single paper you ever published.
Go into bioinformatics, people.
Yeah, guys, if you're a trainee, just go to bioinformatics. It's just insane the amount of that we are now relying on. You cannot analyze this huge, even cytometry. I've been doing cytometry for 10 years. It was really easy when I was a grad student. A few colors gave you the information. Nowadays, if you don't have a 30 color panel, you're missing out. It's like you're missing information you do want to get. And then how do you read that? You cannot just gate your way through 30 colors most of the time in a meaningful way. You can, but you're not going to get the insights that you're looking for.
So I'll add that this is one of those areas I think there's an interesting academic industry dichotomy, is that AI right now is really pretty expensive. I mean, you can go get ChatGPT for $20 or $30 a month, and people can do that. But going and training a full model based on one of those, that you go to OpenAI or whoever and get that and deploy that, and those, the compute for that's really expensive. And this is something that industry has the money and is doing and is not telling anyone. So there's a secret space race going on right now that is very well known in the industry circles that it's happening, but we won't tell each other what we're doing. But there absolutely is immense AI work going on that's already being used to answer a bunch of things that I think the academy will see once it's cheap. But that right now is so expensive that they're only using it to decide if you're going to go forward with a $100 million clinical trial or not, because that's where the economic proposition is today. And I think that's going to be it's going to be one of those things that then pops up elsewhere in a few years.
Well, let's hope it trickles down to the rest of us mortals at some point.
I mean, it'll just like it goes both ways, right? Like sometimes you'll have things that start in the academy and move up, and other times it'll be in industry and come down.
Yeah.
I think AI, just because of the cost, is starting where the money is.
Yeah, it is very expensive. So, yeah.
So to shift in some more like, what's it like to be a podcast host kind of questions. So Brenda, when you got this job 4 years ago, you were an early postdoc. So sort of a trainee. You're now a later postdoc. So what?
Older postdoc.
Older postdoc, more senior postdoc. What impact has the podcast had on your career? But also, I'm going to double that question up and say, and what has been the most challenging part of taking on this job in addition to your day job?
Well, if I may answer the second part first. The time. There's not enough time in the day, and having a full-time job as a postdoc and in this day and age, it's quite. It requires some of my time, even though I do work in Europe where we do have some work-life balance. But finding the time, it's probably a major issue. Everything else, I would say, it's a walk in the park. Once I find the time, I enjoy it enormously. This is an amazing opportunity. Also, it's funny because maybe probably you Americans probably already know this. English is not my native language. I am Argentinian, so I can also speak like this, and then you can tell where I'm from if you want. So keeping the accent, it really takes some brain power. So I'm gonna just revert. So for me, also, I think the opportunity of being exposed to this kind of there's one thing. On the one thing is kind of the practical part is like you get to know people and they get to know you. So you become a person that, you know, if they want to kind of size you up, they can just listen to the podcast and they kind of have a feeling of who I am. And that's nice for breaking the ice. And I think I've made some nice connections through my work here. And on a more philosophical level, let's say, being also knowing all these people and getting to talk to them in a more kind of informal setting, you know, and it's a more, I would say, more peer-to-peer situation. So you're not the trainee asking the big PI, you're just, you know, the interviewer, and people tend to be very relaxed and very helpful and very happy to share. And, you know, they feel that this is, most of our guests have been very enthusiastic and they've been, you know, grateful or, you know, very positive about being invited on the podcast. So the kind of interaction that you get is really nice. It's a very nice dynamic that in a way kind of, you know, bumps your ego a bit, gives you a little bit of confidence that you can actually, you know, articulate in front of very important people. And you might not be, you know, it gives you a little bit of a glow inside. So that's been nice. But that's on a more kind of personal level. But I think more practical is it helps you know people and people know you.
Mm-hmm. That's a great answer. Jason, I have the same question for you. As you had just finished as a MD, PhD, you were finishing up a postdoc when we reached out to you, and you were at a bit of a crossroads. So I know you moved into an industry role shortly after very shortly after, weeks after you took this job. So from your vantage point, and we've already heard a bit about your clinical experience with the COVID situation, but how has taking on this podcast influenced your life, and what has been the most, aside from pronunciation of names and remembering people's names, which Jason is a very intelligent person but cannot do names, which is a challenge when you're
names are hard.
When you're a podcast host. So yeah, maybe I stole your answer there, but
no. So I would say I'm not a trainee anymore career. I've always been in industry doing the podcast. It was literally at the same time. I think my first recording was 2 weeks into my new job, and I got my job offer from STEMCELL 5 days before I got my job offer from Series. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's always been simultaneous. For me, the podcast lets me stay somewhat in academia, which I really like. It's also an immense challenge to juggle the two. Like, as Brenda and you guys know, my schedule books out pretty far in advance, and so finding time in these slots is that is actually the hardest challenge.
Well, and you're working on 2 different time zones,
exactly.
Very different time zones, and then often the guest will be on a 3rd time zone. So that's
Well, the Australia situation is particularly challenging sometimes.
Yeah, and those we know to book more than a month out. But then it's been interesting. You can imagine the conversations I've had to have with the lawyers at my day job just to make sure I can be on here. And they've all been very excited. They also sit me down and talk to me about what I can and can't say. So that's a big thing. But in the end, it's been super beneficial. So just being on the podcast as the host or co-host and getting to keep a foot in immunology has paid giant dividends in a way that I am not legally allowed to talk about for my day job. But it lets me, again, stay grounded and read things I wouldn't otherwise get to be able to read, make connections that you don't realize are going to be useful till 2 years later, and lets me kind of keep the part of academia that I don't get as much of in my day job. I still have a lab. I still get to mentor people. I still get to do research, but it's different, and I can't just I don't have the time in my day to go read a random cell paper about B cells because it's cool, but I do because of the podcast.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So podcast is obviously not a traditional way to communicate science. We normally share science through academic journal articles, through conferences like the one that we're at right now. Podcasting's pretty new and different for a different way to learn about science and a different way to share science. And so this is my favorite topic. This is why I do the job I do, is to provide this kind of scientific communication tool or resource to the communities. So how do you see podcasting fitting into science in the future? And I'm going to combine that with another question again, which is, what do you hope for the future of the Immunology podcast and the role it can play?
So I personally love podcasts. I've been listening to podcasts since my late teens. So that's like 20 years ago, mid-teens. So I have been like, for me, having like having access. So my first kind of like serious podcasting, living in Argentina, was like the BBC. That really helped me with my English and something, get a little bit of like more of a worldly experience, documentaries from around the world. So it became I don't want to say a lifeline because that's a bit dramatic, but it became this kind of connection with that, something that it's bigger than my immediate environment. I grew up in a very small town in the mountains, so and I think that podcast has such a great it's a great medium because you can it's easily accessible. They're I would say by definition free. You can just download them, and you can just fit them in your pocket, in your phone, and whenever you have a downtime. I mean, God forbid you get bored, right? In this attention economy, that's not allowed. So this has to be something. Now it's good to be bored sometimes. But I think it's nice because then you have some company. When I used to have a longer commute, on my bike in Amsterdam, I would listen to podcasts. I hear some people doing in their cars, which I think that's a 30-minute commute in a car. Sounds terrible. So I think it's a great medium. And for science, there's so many science podcasts nowadays. Not only like layman, so there's a lot of layman science, which is fantastic. But I think there's a few. It's just a niche for science podcasting that is mostly directed at other scientists. I was an early listener of, like, for example, I think this Week in Virology, maybe some of you may know. This is one of the OG, I would say, science podcasts. And it was great. It's just that you have this again, it's about accessing people that are far away, that are very smart, that they know their thing. And you as a trainee or as a curious person, you get to learn from their experience, and then they help you in a way. They drive your attention to what's important. And sometimes, given that there's in the internet as a whole, there's so many things, it's really nice to have a curated version of the information that you're looking for by someone that you trust. And I think that's what podcasts like this have, that we have a certain editorial responsibility of bringing people that are meaningful actors in the field, and then you have certain feeling that these people, they know what they're talking about, and that's really nice, especially in this day and age where anybody with a keyboard can just put anything out there. Having a curated source of information that is also entertaining to some extent, so you feel less lonely. That's kind of nice. So I think that's how I see us, the Immunology Podcast, as contributing to the community, providing a steady source of information, of commentary, of access to researchers from across the world. Because of course now we are at the AAI, so this is America, but we have many researchers from Europe, Asia, Oceania, from Australia, from South America. So we do try to bring diversity right to your podcast feed.
Awesome answer. Jason.
So I think the first part's that the journalistic curation, I think, is really important. There's too many papers to read all the time. And so finding sources that you trust that relate to what you do, like, there's a huge marketplace for more than just any one podcast for what you need, because it's impossible to keep up now. And so having someone who distills things that you're interested in and summarize it's great. And that's the other nice part about podcasts, right? Is, as Brenda said, you can listen to it when you're mowing the lawn or on your bike ride or walking back to the Hilton Hawaiian Village after a conference or what have you, right? And so it's a media that lets us to continue to gain information during downtime. And so I think good podcasts distill things so that you can process it during that type of headspace. And I think that's really valuable and a place that I think podcasts really can contribute. I'm surprised there weren't more science podcasts because you had a lot of this in economics and psychology and other things earlier than science. And that served that purpose. Like I think, like Freakonomics is one of the, kind of original OG expert podcasts. And it provided immense value to explaining things to people, more for lay people, but you could have a version for economists as well. And I think that's a niche that we do that I think we need more of. What do I want to see the podcast in the future? I'd love to see us going on lay people science podcasts or just lay people podcasts as scientists to provide information on things, being the expert in the room to help explain what the heck this thing is about immunology. That's kind of where I'd love to see us go, is get on kind of the broader audience as guests sometimes and be able to provide that expertise to a larger community.
That would be fun.
Yeah. My answer to that question is the unscripted conversations. I think the way we communicate science traditionally is very formulaic and very scripted and very unidirectional. And, we tell the very curated version of our scientific work in a paper and in a really, in my opinion, inaccessible voice. The narrative of scientific journal articles is it's a whole other language to learn. So Brenda, you can add that language to your repertoire of languages.
Science-ish.
Yeah, and I think being able to access the researchers that you speak to and have that unscripted conversation just helps people learn and digest the enormous complexity of science so much better. So I love it. That brings us to our last question. That was it. So I want to, before we pass it to the audience for questions, I just want to thank you all for coming. We can't have a live show without an audience. That would just be a regular show if they were just talking to each other. So thank you for joining us. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank the AAI for giving us this opportunity for the second year in a row. This was our dream when we first kind of came up with the idea of partnering with societies, was maybe we could do a live show at a conference one day. And this is the second time we've done it for the Immunology Podcast. So thank you very much for that opportunity. And with that, I will open the floor. You can ask, well, any of us really, but probably want to ask them.
Actually, my first question is to you, Nicole.
Oh, okay.
And that is,
Take that, Jason and Brenda.
You have two absolute jewels here who actually have probably learned on the job training how to do this. But I heard that you interviewed people and that they volunteered. How many people did you have to troll through to find these two?
I don't, And
was it obvious at the beginning?
It was obvious. It was, our biggest concern. I remember specifically asking Jason, how the heck are you going to do this? You are a medical doctor and a researcher and a father, and don't even start asking Jason about his hobbies. He's got many in there. and I was like, are you going to be able to do this? So and we knew we wanted some diversity in our hosts, so not gender diversity, ethnic background, global, whatever we could find. And so we got very lucky, because I will say there wasn't as many applicants as you probably think, because we had no real platform to advertise the job to, because we didn't have a podcast yet. So we were advertising for host for an immunology podcast on the STEMCELL podcast, which is not the right audience to advertise to. And we just, you're right, we got two jewels. So I think it was, I know I'm at a scientific conference, but can I say that it was just like the universe aligning here?
Well, there's also irony, right? Like I found the ad for the job posting because I used an ungodly amount of intesticult in my because I started as an intestinal stem cell biologist who does immunology. So.
Intesticult is one of the products that STEMCELL Technologies makes. It's for culturing intestinal organoids, and so that's So he probably saw the ad through STEMCELL.
Yeah, he loves enterocytes more than he should, but maybe
best immune cell.
So maybe I can ask both of you a question, which is, there's an extraordinary distrust of science in 2025, and I have no clue how that came about. I mean, we were all doing our hard work. We were making science accessible. We were communicating with each other. We were trying to do the very best we can. And yet there is this sense, and I hear it over and over and over again, that we're going to try to make America healthy again. We're going to bring back trust in our scientific institutions. How did we ever lose it in the first place?
Go ahead, Jason and Brenda, take that one on.
Oh boy. All right. So, I'm going to preface this by saying I describe myself as obnoxiously moderate. But I think while the people on the ground, largely all of us in the room, we're really doing the right thing and focusing on our labs and focusing on the science, at the larger level, there was some politicization, and there was things that you were allowed to talk about and not talk about, and ways you needed to frame things. And trust takes forever to earn and is really easy to lose. And to me, I think it was the fact that some knowledge became political, some data you'd more want to share than others. And so then when scientific issues became politicized, there was backlash if one side was ever wrong about anything. And in science, we're always wrong about something, right? And so then trust got broken. And to play it forward a little bit, I think the advice that I've really tried to adhere to is that you have to be apolitical in describing the science. And even if one side of the aisle or the other favors one notion or another, you just need to say, this is the facts, this is what I see. And if you see it becoming political, that is where I think us as scientists on the ground have a lot of strength to say, no, now we're getting political. Let's take a step back. Even though we're saying X, we need to have our humility about this and push back on politicization of the people who are political appointees sometimes.
Coming from, an outsider perspective, but living, it's funny because coming from Argentina, the trust in the vaccine and in immunology is actually pretty high. And Argentina has been a country that historically has had a very exceptional public health environment, and people trust. So I think in the case of the US, it's just about not only politicization, but also, and if I may say, I think this disenfranchisement of people and alienation from the people, the scientists, scientific community from the regular citizens. And I think that generates this trust. And it's really, and it's not only on immunology, but in so many other aspects. And I think from my kind of external viewpoint, that is a major issue, is the separation, the class separation between educated, highly educated people that are not highly educated, and how that generates distrust. Because in other countries where you don't have this, people just trust that scientists, they know what they are good people that mean well. And I think that's kind of the feeling that now, because there's just a wall. There's silos that are separated. And I would say in other places, what you also see in Europe is a bit of just basic skepticism and defiance to authority, and the idea that scientific community has authority. And you see people like in Germany that want the measles vaccination. People that won't vaccinate measles is more about not trusting, like just being against the current, and just being free thinkers. And I think that's a different sources of this content. But I think, from my very humble opinion, is this separation, and this the population does not have access to this, the information, does not have access to the resources, and that generates this distrust.
For me, I think as scientists, we're trained to live in uncertainty and to understand that we're going to get a lot wrong, and that we're going to learn through iteration, and there's going to be a lot of nuance as we learn. And when you're in a global health crisis like we were in with COVID, I think in general, human nature is to not feel comfortable with uncertainty and nuance. And I think we have to train it into ourselves as scientists. That's why we're in training for so long, is to learn how to ask questions and live without answers, and keep asking questions. And when that has to pass on to the public, and we ask the public to bear with us because we don't know the answers. There is no yes or no, right or wrong, A or B at this point. There's just a lot of nuance and uncertainty. There was very little tolerance for that, and rightly so. People were scared. And that meant that science, I think it just put us in a really hard place as scientists, because we had to ask a lot of the public, and they couldn't do it. As humans, we really struggle with that.
I think we get bored as scientists if there is certainty and there is no nuance. It's no longer interesting anymore somehow.
Well, it's knowledge. We need to ask the next question then. Yeah. Speaking of that, let's ask the next question. I'm so good at segues today. I should do this more often.
A little short, but yeah. So I am a second-year trainee in my PhD program, and I'm really interested in science communication. I was just kind of curious how you guys got into it and what brought you into this field.
So that podcast I started with way back when, before the Immunology Podcast, was something called Bullshido, which is a martial arts and eventually
told you not to ask him about his hobbies, and you went and asked him about
skepticism thing. And so when the pandemic, I'd gone on once before about health things, but then when the pandemic hit, it's a nonprofit institute, and I'm part of the board, so I went on multiple times. And so for me, it was the emergency of COVID, saying, okay, I need to explain things to people. And then simultaneously with that, being pulled into the school district and having to explain things to people. And as, a naturally talkative dude who was, since first grade, explaining to people how to fix their Apple PC so that their printer would work, as a kid, that just kind of naturally happened that way. So for me, it was, the standard genetic predisposition plus environmental trigger led me to this.
Yeah. That's. I mean, let's be honest. I think the both of us have a bit of that. I just thought I'm a very talkative person. I'm quick to a word, and I just got everybody around me was tired of hearing me yap. So when I heard there was an opportunity of getting paid for talking about science, I just jumped at it. Now, yes, that's kind of like deep down, that is the reason. So again, I saw the ad. So STEMCELL was looking for host, and to be honest, I had considered it. I really enjoy communicating. Really enjoy discussing science, and so when the opportunity arose, I just applied, and I was fortunate enough to get selected in the end after a few rounds of interviews. And so it was, I think in the end, it was a kind of right time, right place situation in which I might have just started something similar by myself, but this is so much nicer, because if anything, I've learned that producing a podcast is so much work. We're so lucky that we just have to do just read the papers and talk to the scientists, and bring our editorial kind of expertise, and these nice people, they take care of the rest. So it's such a privileged position to be.
Yeah. Brenda, don't tell Nicole, but I didn't even know the position was going to be paid when I first applied.
You know what? I don't think so either.
Oh,
I
no.
I think if they had offered, I would have just done it for free. Why not? At some point,
Note to self when contract renewals come up. So I'll answer that question too, because I get it a lot, and I don't tend to be the one behind the microphone or on the stage. I do it every so often, but for me, it was that I was terrible at lab work, and it was a means to an end, but it was a struggle for me. And I found that as I was going through my academic training, where I tended to thrive and get the most feedback and the most, just reward was when I was asked to do a talk or write a paper or teach or anything that involved communication. And I started to put, like a knock over the head, like maybe that's what I'm good at. Maybe that's what I should be doing. And then I needed a job, and I got very lucky, and STEMCELL Technologies was hiring for a scientific communications manager to build up their science communication program. And I ended up finding that I could have a lot more impact on science communication from the industry perspective, which was a surprise to me. I didn't think that was going to happen. But I think your question is, how do I do it? How do I get into scientific communication? I think the answer, as you've heard, is different for every person. And I always say, I wish I could tell you, go to this one science communication training program at this one institution, and that's your path forward. And it's simply not. It is a different path for everybody, but it is an essential role that we have to figure out as scientists. Thankfully, there's a lot more jobs that are paid jobs that have actual work-life balance and, salaries associated with them that are in science communication now than there were 10, 15 years ago when I was starting. At that time, it was you're going to be a freelance journalist or, something like that. So there are a lot more opportunities, but I would say keep asking that question because somebody's going to come up with an opportunity for you to pursue.
Yeah.
Hi there. So I have a question as a newer trainee. So there's all these emerging fields, and we touched on like bioinformatics and AI, and there's this like public policy and public communication piece. I guess from all these people that you've spoken to, do you have any suggestions for newer scientists on maybe newer or surprising skills that you think are important that might not have been really emphasized so much before, but maybe now really will help progress your career?
I was going to actually pick an old field that people forget about that has a giant crisis that needs lots of immunology, which is toxicology. And this is a shout out to my wife a little bit, but every single drug on the market requires toxicology, and that whole, oh my God, we're in an immunology heyday means that a lot of drugs work through the immune system or are antibodies. And so understanding like not just the mechanism of action, but what you're doing to the rest of the immune system is vital for every single thing going into people's bodies in every single clinical trial. And it's a field that has no organic pipeline from grad school to industry, or even there's academic toxicology through the National Toxicology Program. And it is a field that is starving for people of literally everything else. And then you can talk about using AI for AI-based toxicology analyses or different, immune system tools for that. But it's a giant opportunity that people, I think, is don't realize very often.
Yeah, I would say also understanding. I'm not from a medical field, but I would say also kind of pathology and all those diseases that have an immunological component that sometimes you just cannot just see it by staining on a slide. You need to understand a little bit more to get more information that you need to interpret as an immunologist. So that's kind of my perspective. But I think a cool area of research, I don't know exactly where it's going to, but I just find it so cool. It's like synthetic biology, synthetic immunology. Because again, the idea that basically immune cells are kind of little robots that they take an input and they give an output. And those things are kind of, they're just independent of each other in a way. You just have, mechanisms. You have mechanisms that interpret a signal, and then other ones that just output something, a cytokine, a behavior. And I guess the idea that you could transmit information and through using this mechanisms, I find it very intriguing. I don't know where the field is going, to be honest, but that feels like it must be really cool to kind of train these robots in ways that are completely new, that are not necessarily a TCR, which we already know, T-cells already have it. Just put something completely from scratch. Just design it and just put it on an immune cell and see what it does. That's kind of the field that excites me.
Thank you for all coming to the live show of the Immunology Podcast here at AAI, Immunology 2025. Thank you to Dr. Nicole Quinn for interviewing us and to the AAI for hosting us. Of course, if you want to find out how to get a hold of us or have questions, you can email us at info@immunologypodcast.com. You can find us on X at ImmunoPodcast or on Blue Sky, which is the brand new one, at immunologypodcast.com. Thank you all for being here.